President Biden gave an interview with CNN's host, Fareed Zakaria, where he talked about how he'd like to rearrange the Israeli government. Uh, the cannons of war are beginning to sound on Israel's border with Lebanon. And there was a meeting yesterday showdown actually, between the government and Attorney General Bahram Miyarev. And this week we're going to face another day of rage by the angry, angry left. For all that and a lot more, stay tuned. Hey, I'm Carolyn Glick. Welcome to my news analysis, which is tentatively called my cold open until we change the name again. And I just want to get straight into it. So over the weekend, President Biden gave an interview to CNN's Fareed Zakaria. And when he was asked about Israel and his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, Biden said a couple of really interesting things.
I've been, I think it's fair to say, an unyielding supporter of Israel I've only been around a couple of years, but for as long as I've been around. I'm one of those who believes that Israel's ultimate security rests in a two-state solution. I think it's a mistake to think that as some members of his cabinet, and this is one of the most extreme members of cabinets that I've seen, the fact that the Palestinian Authority has lost its credibility, not necessarily because of what Israel's done, just because it's just lost its credibility, number one. And number two, created a vacuum for extremism among the Palestinians. The PLA, there's some very extreme elements. So it's not all Israel now in the West Bank, all Israel's problem, but they are part of the problem. And particularly those individuals in the cabinet who say they have no right to we can settle anywhere we want, they have no right to be here, et cetera. And I think we're talking with them regularly, trying to tamp down what's going on, and hopefully Bibi will continue to move toward moderation and changing the court.
Well, the Palestinian Authority has lost its credibility among Palestinians, so it's not all Israel's fault that we're having this flare-up on the Israel-Lebanon border, which is true, although it's not clear where he wanted to take that. The fact is that the Palestinian Authority is collapsing, or it's no longer really present in any coherent form, at least not one that the United States should be paying $500 million a year to prop up. Palestinian Authority security forces and Fatah forces aligned with them are bragging now that they've carried out most of the terrorist attacks against Israel from Judea and Samaria, and the Fatah forces themselves are saying that they have no interest whatsoever in working with Israel to quell terrorism because they're with the terrorists. As we talked about last week, Palestinians don't want peace with Israel. They don't want the Palestinian Authority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what Biden said reflected the truth, but then that, of course, raises the question, why is the United States insisting on maintaining the Palestinian Authority? At any rate, so he said that the Palestinian Authority is in trouble, and then he moved to Netanyahu, and he said, well, I really care about Israel. I've cared about Israel throughout my 6 decades in politics. But he doesn't like Netanyahu's government, and Netanyahu has to figure out a way to moderate his government, particularly 2 cabinet ministers who he didn't name. But of course, everybody knows that they're talking about the cabinet ministers, the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich in the United States has been effectively BDSing them, refusing to meet with them. Bezalel Smotrich got the cold shoulder from the Department of the Treasury when he was in the United States. So that's interesting because, of course, the United States is Israel's largest trading partner, and Israel has massive economic relations with the United States, but they don't like the politics of the finance minister, so they've been boycotting him, same with the national security ministers in charge of Israel police. So that's a problem. The United States wants a vassal state, doesn't like this whole messy democracy, which explains why they also oppose judicial reform, since judicial reform expands the powers of Israel's democratically elected institutions, the Knesset and the government, against its non-elected, so far self-selecting judicial oligarchy and legal fraternity. But so that was really sort of an interesting statement by Biden. What he said in so many words, is that his administration's support for Israel, such as it is conditional on Israel having a left-wing government or a leftist-dominated government. So that was a distressing aspect of U.S. Policy, but it goes to really the heart of what American Middle East policy under the Biden administration has been, which is to realign American foreign policy in the Middle East away from Israel, away from Saudi Arabia, and towards Iran. Another interesting statement then that Biden made in the interview on Sunday was that he didn't see prospects in the near future for Saudi-Israeli normalization, and that's true. And the reason is because, well, it's twofold. One is because, as we've discussed on this show repeatedly, the Saudis, the UAE, and other Gulf states no longer trust the United States to protect them from Iran, which is why Saudi Arabia allowed China to mediate a normalization of Saudi-Iranian relations earlier this year, and why the Saudis and the UAE and others are entangling their national infrastructures with Chinese Huawei 5G networks, as we discussed last week with Chris Whitty from the Signal Group. China is building Saudi Arabia's city of the future, Neom, which is supposed to be the emblematic demonstration of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's vision for Saudi Arabia as a modern state that's not entirely reliant on its oil exports for its economic security. So that's a real problem. And another thing that I'll just say about the U.S. and China in the Middle East is I think one of the most remarkable things that she said was that Iraq is the third largest recipient of China's Belt and Road funding. China has taken over Iraq's oil fields. And that really speaks to the utter failure of America's multi-trillion, multi-thousand U.S. soldiers' investment in Iraq post Saddam Hussein, it's a terrible thing that thousands of U.S. forces were killed to try to secure Iraq and free it from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein and their extraordinary efforts, which ended up failing, but to institute democracy and freedom in a post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. And on the embers of that failed American policy in Iraq, China has just sort of come in and swallowed that country for itself through economic investment. And it really speaks to some of the things that then President Trump was saying, that why would the United States fight such an extraordinarily expensive war, both financially and in terms of the lives of American forces lost there, only to transfer the country and its oil wealth to China. But that appears to be what's happened. At any rate, going back to Biden, the Saudis aren't going to make a U.S.-mediated deal right now under the Biden administration with Israel because they don't trust Biden to provide them with the security guarantees that they require against Iran and against Muslim Brotherhood and Iranian Shiite terror forces that are attacking the kingdom. So under the circumstances, no, there isn't any chance of formally normalizing Israeli-Saudi ties, unfortunately. And again, it has nothing to do with the composition of Netanyahu's government. It has to do with composition, unfortunately, of the U.S. administration and their policy goals. And that brings us to the second subject that I wanted to talk about, which is really the most acutely disturbing subject on the agenda today, which is the things that are heating up. Hezbollah and Lebanese armed forces increased aggression, cross-border aggression on Mount Dov in the frontier between Israel and Lebanon twice this week, or 3 times this week. We've seen infiltrations of Israeli territory by Hezbollah and Lebanese armed forces, or last week, I'm sorry. And things just keep heating up. 2 months ago, Hezbollah moved to build 2 tents on Israeli territory on Mount Dov. And so far, through mediation from the UN, apparently Israel managed to convince them to remove only one of those tents, and one is still remaining there. And it's really, really troubling. We had Lebanese armed forces pointing RPGs at Israeli tanks and jeeps on Israeli territory from inside of Israeli territory on July 5th. And then on July 6th, we had anti-tank rockets fired at Israel from Lebanon. All of this, of course, is done under the aegis of Hezbollah, which controls both the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah and everything that essentially happens, and the Palestinian forces as well that are operating in South Lebanon. Israel faces a very, very dangerous situation vis-a-vis Hezbollah. They have advanced weapons. They have seasoned forces that fought for over a decade in Syria, in Iraq, and in other battlefields, while Israel used its commando brigade last week for a mini operation in Jenin. That is the forces that the IDF High Command decided needed to fight Palestinian terrorist forces in Jenin weren't normal infantry brigades or armored brigades. Rather, it was a special forces brigade in our special forces command. So the top forces in the IDF were deployed to Jenin, and obviously the capabilities of the Palestinians in Jenin are absolutely nothing in comparison to the capabilities of Hezbollah, both in terms of firepower and in terms of training and capabilities of the forces themselves. So it's a very dangerous situation. And we see that Hezbollah is ordering these probing attacks, these attacks against Israel to see how we respond to them. And so far, Israel has tried to respond to them through diplomatic means, through UN mediation, or now the latest report that just came out last night, I'm recording this on Monday, July 10th, was that the United States has now presented Israel with an offer to mediate the issue of the Hezbollah tent inside of Israel and Mount Dov with Hezbollah, and the United States acting, I guess, as Hezbollah's agent or representative in these talks, is saying, well, if Israel stops building up its defenses along the border, particularly in the village of Rajar, which is split half in Lebanon, half in Israel, then Hezbollah will remove its tent. So here's the United States saying to Israel, don't defend yourselves against Hezbollah, and Hezbollah will remove its tent from your territory. And this is a really hostile position, obviously, and what's most distressing about it is that it's being presented as a valid offer by the United States to Israel. So I think what we're seeing is mobilization, and there was a report as well in the Lebanese Naharnet website that said that an American national serving as a UN mediator is supposed to arrive in Lebanon this week to meet with Hassan Nasrallah and discuss with him Hezbollah's claims to Mount Dov. Now, Mount Dov, otherwise known as the Sheba Farms, is an area that Israel captured from Syria. The UN recognizes that during the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel withdrew from South Lebanon to the internationally recognized border between Israel and Lebanon on May 31st, 2000, the UN recognized and verified that Israel had left all of Lebanese territory behind and that it had moved to the internationally recognized border. And that border on Israel's side includes the Golan Heights, which includes Mount Dov, which includes the Golan, that area that Israel applied its sovereignty to in 1981, and the United States recognized Israeli sovereignty over in 2019. So we're talking about Israeli territory, but Hezbollah, in order to have a claim to a casus belli against Israel, didn't recognize that Israel had withdrawn from to the international border and claimed Mount Dov, the Sheba Farms, for Lebanon. And this was to be used over the intervening 23 years repeatedly as a casus belli for attacking Israeli forces located in the strategic area, which is massive. So Hezbollah is falsely claiming Lebanese sovereignty over former Syrian territory that Israel applied its sovereignty to in 1981. And the United States or the UN representative, who is unnamed, but who was stipulated in the report that he is an American national, and is clearly going to be coordinating his positions with the Biden administration, now wants to talk to Hezbollah about its claims to those areas to which Lebanon has no claims. So what we're seeing, I think, is a mobilization led by the United States of the international community on behalf of Hezbollah and against Israel at a time when Hezbollah is carrying out ever-escalating acts of aggression against Israel. You had to add to that, by the way, that there was another incursion into Israeli territory last month around Manara, the kibbutz Manara on the border. So we're looking at constantly escalating acts of aggression by Hezbollah, which is armed to the teeth and has prepared war plans as going back to 2008 to invade the Upper Galilee and to overrun Israeli communities along the border in their war plan. And this is the international mobilization that we're seeing. And rather than throw out the Hezbollah operatives who set up their encampment in Israeli territory, Israel's looking to UN mediation for this, which I think exposes fear and unreadiness or unwillingness to fight Hezbollah, and that's always dangerous to do. You don't want to show weakness to an aggressor, and unfortunately, that's what Israel seems to be doing. So that's in Lebanon, and my 2 cents on that are simply that I think that Israel is better off if war is upon us. Israel is better off opening that war. That is taking the first step, because otherwise it's going to be Hezbollah, not Israel, that defines the battle space. And the battle space has already been defined so much by the fortifications that Hezbollah has built, the 150,000 missiles, many of them very, very powerful, pointing at Israeli society from Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. And here I'm just going to add one side note, which is that much of the threat that we're facing also owes to the fact that the United States has built the Lebanese armed forces up. Currently, the United States, and I would argue probably in contravention of U.S. law against terror financing, is funding the salaries of 100,000 Lebanese soldiers and officers and paying them in cash every month. That's $55 million that the United States is paying. Obviously, it's also been arming the Lebanese armed forces and training the Lebanese armed forces with U.S. Special Forces operatives inside of Lebanon since 2005 at a minimum. So this is all a very difficult situation. It's very dangerous. It's developing. It's escalating. Hezbollah operating openly with the Lebanese armed forces is escalating its operations against Israel along the border. And so this is something that's very, very disturbing. And again, my 2 cents is that if war is coming, then it's best for Israel to shape the battlefield and not leave it for others to face. And now I'm just going to give you my weekly update on the left's insurrection against the government and against the people of Israel. So, their acts of harassment against government ministers are, of course, ongoing. On Sunday, they had an interesting government meeting where Netanyahu and his ministers summoned the Attorney General Gali Marabiara and the state prosecutor and Amir Eisman and their deputies to the government to give an accounting for the fact that they are not enforcing the law at all against the rioters who are carrying out acts of criminal conspiracy, organizing the blockage of air travel at Ben Gurion Airport. They did it last week. They intend to do it again on Tuesday, starting at 4:30 in the afternoon, blocking highway traffic. They're planning to do it on Tuesday in what they call a day of rage. In Haifa, starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in Tel Aviv, starting, I think, also around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and so on and so forth. So we have these declared acts of civil insurrection in Israel. You have open interviews by leaders of this insurrection with Israeli media organizations saying, yeah, we know it's unpleasant and people are mad at us, but we are not allowed to be nice now because our country is at risk and we stand in the balance, and therefore we have to take aggressive measures even if they're unpopular with the public. So they're provoking the public, they're provoking the government, and the government, Netanyahu and his ministers, asked some very harsh questions to Ba'arav Miar, the Attorney General. You just call her Sar because she was appointed by former Justice Minister Gideon Sar, who has made his mission in life destroying Netanyahu. She was left. She remained in her position when the new government was formed and has used her position to throw spokes in the wheels of every government policy and initiative and legislative agenda, and to demonize the government, and most importantly, to facilitate the left campaign to overthrow the government in the name of democracy because they don't like the outcome of the elections. So she didn't have any answers. None of them did. And what was most interesting about their answers is that they showed that they don't seem to have any real appreciation that in a government ruled by law, there is one rule of law for everyone. They kept insisting that there have to be distinctions, but they wouldn't make any distinctions because they said the government doesn't have any right to understand how they make their decisions because the demonstrations are being directed against the government, and therefore the government is in a conflict of interest. Of course, they are as well, because the government's judicial reform package would also place limits on the power of the Attorney General and the legal advisors to the government ministries and force them to accept that they are only advisors and that they can't dictate policies for the government. So they're in a conflict of interest, and therefore they shouldn't be involved in this at all. But regardless of the situation of what it should be, this is what it is. And it's very unfortunate that all of this is happening at a time when Israel is facing a profound threat of war from Hezbollah, which makes sense from Hezbollah's perspective. Why would you wait until situation has settled down in Israel to strike? You, of course, want to strike when things are unsettled. So the left, in their rejection of the legitimacy of the elected government of Israel and their efforts to stir up civil war and violence, are playing into the hands of Hezbollah in a very real and tangible way, as we see in the north. And by the way, I forgot to mention that they're also saying Ehud Barak, former prime minister and defense minister, and now the generalissimo of the forces trying to overthrow the government and tear apart Israeli society. So he wrote this article in Haaretz, and he gave this interview last week to one of the television channels where he gave explicit plans. He set out explicit plans for how they're going to break up the IDF. And this is, of course, obviously a call for rebellion and a form, I would argue, of treason. But, he hasn't been investigated. He hasn't been called into an interrogation cell in the Shabak or in the police for what he did. To the contrary, they're continuing and escalating their calls for the pilots, for the special forces, for the cyber warriors, who are more or less identified with the left, to refuse to serve in the army because today, Monday, in a preliminary reading, the Knesset is supposed to pass begin shuttling through the legislative process their first judicial reform bill, which is a bill that would limit the court's ability to make rulings on the basis of the completely subjective reasonableness standard. We've talked about it before. The court just in January barred Shas leader, one of the coalition partners, Aryeh Deri, from serving as a minister because he had reached a plea deal on some minor tax infraction in 2021. And they said that because he did this, it's unreasonable for him to serve as a minister in the army. In the government, thus disenfranchising 400,000 plus voters who voted for Shas, with the full expectation that Deri would serve as a minister. So the idea of this proposed legislation is to place severe limits on the court's ability not to ban, which is what should be done, but to place significant limits on the court's right to use the reasonableness standard to overthrow government policies and Knesset laws. And the justices themselves said they don't really care about it because they can use other non-legal standards to overturn government policies and Knesset laws, like proportionality, which is another completely subjective, turgid concept that can mean anything you want it to mean. So they plan to continue to do that. But anyway, so because the government is passing this weakened version of one of the four components of the original reform package, the left has decided that they have the right to set the country on fire yet again tomorrow. So all of this, I think, is reaching sort of a fever pitch. Even Channel 12, which completely supports all of these, the insurrectionists, they published a poll on Saturday night that showed that over 65% of Israelis oppose what they're doing in Tel Aviv, blocking major traffic arteries. They oppose the free-for-all riots outside of the homes of government ministers, and they oppose closing Ben Gurion Airport as part of their riots. But as I said, they don't care. So we'll see, as support for the leftist insurrectionists continues to dwindle in the summer months and the numbers of people coming to their demonstrations on Saturday nights continues to diminish, we'll have to see what happens. Obviously, there's a key core that's very, very powerful and extremely wealthy and well-financed that will never stop unless the Attorney General starts allowing the police to enforce the laws against them. But I don't see that happening anyway, not in the coming week. So maybe next week when I do my quick take or my cold take or whatever it is that we're calling Carolyn's Cold Cuts, whatever it is we're calling this news analysis here at JNS, next week maybe we'll have more closure. But I do just want to go back to the Lebanon issue because despite everybody's engagement with the domestic politics in Israel, we do have to keep our eye on the prize, and the situation on the border with Lebanon is becoming very, very perilous. It's a shame that at this time the United States is continuing to back completely the Lebanese armed forces, which are simply an auxiliary unit of Hezbollah, acting openly at the pleasure and on orders from Hezbollah and attacking Israel. But that's a situation we face, and it's a difficult needle to thread. But we're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to do it in a way that takes this sort of Damocles away from our necks, coming from Lebanon. So those are my thoughts this week, and I have a great show also in the Carolyn Glick Show. I'm going to be interviewing Judge Alan Clemens, who spearheaded all of the anti-BDS legislation in the state legislatures in the United States. Last week, John Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, enacted an executive order banning BDS in New Hampshire, and we're going to talk about that. That's the 37th state out of 50 in the United States that has passed anti-BDS laws or taken regulatory action against it. So we're going to talk about that and a lot more at the Carolyn Glick Show. Stay tuned for that, or tune into that one as well, and we'll see you again next week.